Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Miss Marple and secrets buried with her, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Miss Marple. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts. Let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Widow Who Died Twice. Rain lashed against the narrow windows of Old Bailey Lane, a soft but persistent tapping that echoed through the otherwise silent village of St. Millicent. The chimneys of Honeysuckle Cottage puffed weakly against the grey sky, and the scent of wet earth and coal smoke clung to everything. It was not the sort of morning anyone would go walking, unless absolutely necessary, which made it all the more peculiar when Mrs. Crabtree, the baker's wife, came charging into the post office like a woman possessed, her boots dripping and her hat askew. "She's dead," she blurted, wild-eyed, her breath misting in the chilled air. "Mrs. Rosalind Humphreys, the widow Humphreys, she's gone. Dead, in her parlour, stone cold." Inside, Mr. Larch, the postmaster, looked up from stamping letters with a frown. "I thought you just saw her yesterday. Told us yourself she was pruning the hydrangeas." "She was," Mrs. Crabtree exclaimed. "I spoke to her at 5:30. She waved from her garden like she always does, gloves on, that silly sun hat perched on her head, humming to herself like a tune only she knew. But this morning, no answer at the door, and the lights still on in the parlour. I got that strange feeling, like when the air feels wrong. I peered in through the window, and there she was, slumped in the armchair, just sitting there like a doll, and the front door was locked, bolted from the inside. By mid-morning, the village had all but abandoned its chores. A small crowd had gathered under umbrellas at the wrought-iron gate of Honeysuckle Cottage, murmuring and speculating with the restraint peculiar to English villages. The constable from Gresham Green had been summoned, though he arrived more flustered than prepared, his bicycle chain soaked and his notes flapping. The doctor came, frowning, with his leather case and silver-rimmed spectacles, and pronounced the widow quite dead. No sign of trauma, no wounds. Simply gone. That should have been the end of it. A tragedy, yes, but nothing more. She was 73 after all. Widowed young, no children, and scarcely seen outside her garden. The official verdict leaned toward natural causes. Until Miss Jane Marple arrived, summoned not by alarm, but by an instinct honed through decades of quiet observation and knitting circles. She stood in the rain with her umbrella tilted back, eyes narrowed as she regarded the small gate and the creeping ivy that had begun to reclaim the cottage bricks. A slight figure, dressed in a sensible grey coat and blue felt hat, she might easily have been mistaken for any other elderly woman come to pay respects, were it not for her eyes. Those eyes missed nothing. "I heard," she said quietly to Reverend Burrows, who stood beside her, "that she was seen yesterday evening?" "Indeed," the vicar replied, dabbing his glasses with a handkerchief. "Mrs. Crabtree swears by it, said she waved to her while tending the garden." Miss Marple stepped through the gate. The lock was unbroken. She ran her gloved fingers over the bolt on the inside of the door and inspected the key still in the lock. She walked the length of the cottage, peered through the back window, and took note of the muddy prints left by the constable near the hedgerow. Then she stepped into the parlour, where the widow's body remained in state. Rosalind Humphreys sat upright in the armchair by the hearth, hands resting in her lap, eyes half closed as though she'd nodded off mid-thought. A cup of tea rested on the side table, untouched, steamless. On the lace doily beneath it, a faint ring of moisture remained, as if a previous cup had been hastily removed. Miss Marple's gaze flicked to the fireplace, ashes cold. No fire since the night before. Her nose twitched faintly. "Dr. Langley," she said softly, "you say she likely died during the night." The doctor nodded, puzzled. "Hard to pinpoint exactly. Sometime after supper. No signs of struggle. No toxins I can see, though it's all quite preliminary." "No doubt," Miss Marple murmured. "And no one entered or left?" "Not unless they can walk through walls." She walked back toward the front hall. Her fingers hovered over the mahogany coat rack, then down to the umbrella stand. There, in the corner, a small splash of dried mud stained the white tile. "Curious," she said aloud, though no one appeared to be listening. Later that afternoon, she sat with tea at the vicarage, the fire crackling cheerfully despite the gloom outside. The vicar's wife poured milk and offered currant scones. "It's strange, isn't it?" she said, lowering her voice. "I never quite liked Mrs. Humphreys, always kept to herself, but still, she was terribly alive yesterday." "Quite," Miss Marple replied, "which makes it all the more perplexing that she may, in fact, have already been dead." The vicar's wife blinked. I don't follow." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "It's the simplest explanation, you see. If the front and back doors were bolted from the inside and no one had broken a window, then it follows that no one entered after her death. But if that is true, how was she seen alive after she was already dead?" The room fell quiet. Even the ticking clock on the mantel seemed to slow. "There was no gardening hat on the hook," Miss Marple added absently, "and no sign of fresh soil on her gloves." Yet Mrs. Crabtree was adamant. The hat, the gloves, the wave from the garden, at precisely 5:30. The vicar frowned. "Do you suspect an impersonation?" "Oh, not an impersonation, but perhaps a manipulation." She reached into her reticule and retrieved a small object, a pressed hydrangea blossom, still faintly blue. "I found this beneath the back window, alongside a trail of muddy prints not belonging to the constable, as if someone had circled the cottage, carefully avoiding being seen." "But who?" the vicar asked, lowering his voice. "That," Miss Marple said, sipping her tea, "is precisely what I mean to find out." The next day brought a murmur of scandal. Inspector Dermot Walsh, newly assigned to the county constabulary and brimming with efficient self-confidence, arrived from London to assess the matter. A sharp-featured man in his 40s, he bore the air of someone unimpressed by village eccentricities. "Natural death," he said, scanning his notes. "Old lady? Recluse? No signs of foul play. This isn't Scotland Yard's business." "And yet," Miss Marple said sweetly, "perhaps you'll explain how a dead woman watered her garden 12 hours after her demise." The inspector's jaw tensed. "Eyewitnesses misremember. Happens all the time." "Of course," she nodded. "But Mrs. Crabtree is not the only one. Young Thomas Fielding also saw her. He told me this morning. Saw her through the hedge while delivering eggs. That makes 2 witnesses." Inspector Walsh paused. "And you, Miss Marple, what is your interest in all this?" "Oh, none at all," she said mildly. "Only that I have seen something like this before. Years ago, in Ledbury, A man propped his dead aunt in the drawing-room chair every evening while his solicitor cousin made the rounds, gathering signatures for documents she could no longer legally approve. Curious business, really. Inheritance law can be so dull otherwise. At the mention of inheritance, the inspector's brows lifted. Did the widow have any heirs? Miss Marple gave a prim smile. As it happens, her late husband's nephew, Charles Endicott, arrived in the village only last week. From Portsmouth, I believe. Quite the surprise visit. Indeed, Mr. Endicott had been seen about the village, tall, well-dressed, the sort of man who smiled too widely and spoke too fast. He claimed to be reconnecting with Aunt Rosalind, though no one could recall her ever mentioning him. Miss Marple visited him at the Rose and Thistle, where he occupied the best upstairs room. He greeted her with charm, offered tea he didn't drink, and seemed, to her trained eye, unusually eager to discuss his whereabouts the previous evening. Yes, I was at the pub all night, he insisted, playing cards with the locals. They'll vouch for me. Miss Marple nodded gently. Of course, though I wonder, Mr. Endicott, if you might tell me when you last saw your aunt alive. He hesitated. Oh, yesterday morning, around 11. Not in the garden at 5:30, he blinked. No, I was gone by then. Curious, that's when two others claimed to have seen her, and yet she was already dead. There it was, the flinch, not large, but real. Miss Marple rose. Thank you. You've been very helpful. Outside the inn, the storm had passed, leaving puddles in the cobblestones. Children kicked at them as their mothers collected eggs from the grocer. The village breathed again, but uneasily, as if something dark lingered just beneath the surface. That evening, Miss Marple returned to the cottage. She stood once more in the narrow parlour, lit now only by the last of the dusky light. She placed the pressed hydrangea on the side table beside the cold tea. There was one thing she had not shared with the inspector. In the kitchen drawer, tucked beneath old receipts and letters, she had found a photograph. Faded, curled at the edges. It showed Mrs. Humphreys, 20 years younger, standing beside a boy in sailor's uniform. The boy looked very much like Charles Endicott, but the back of the photo had been scrawled with something more damning than resemblance. He must never know the truth. I will take it to my grave. Signed, R.H. As Miss Marple tucked the photo back into her handbag, the grandfather clock struck 6. Outside, a figure stood across the lane, watching the house. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It appeared the widow might yet speak again, from beyond the grave, and someone somewhere was already afraid of what she might say. Chapter 2. Tea interrupted by a telegram. The storm had not let up. Rain fell in sheets over St. Millicent, turning garden paths into shallow streams and clinging to every hedge and shutter like a persistent whisper. In the village post office, where the smell of ink, musty envelopes and coal dust hung thick, Mr. Larch lit the oil lamp with shaking fingers. He was not a nervous man by nature, but something about the brown envelope in his hand had made him unsteady. It had arrived early that morning, stamped urgent, and addressed to Mrs. Rosalind Humphreys, Honeysuckle Cottage, St. Millicent. No return address. The handwriting, looped and elegant, was unmistakably feminine and slightly old-fashioned, the kind once taught in finishing schools and convents. But it was too late. The widow had been dead for more than a day when the telegram arrived. Mr. Larch set it aside, but not without unease. There was a rule, of course. One did not open the post, But the widow's death, so sudden and unsettling, gnawed at him. The envelope trembled as he placed it in the drawer. Perhaps he would speak to the constable, or Miss Marple. Yes, Miss Marple would know what to make of it. He never got the chance. That afternoon, the post office door creaked open. The bell above the frame gave a half-hearted jingle. Charles Endicott stepped in, brushing rain from his overcoat, his collar raised high. He looked every inch the polished gentleman, well-groomed, dry boots, a faint cologne clinging to him like confidence. But his eyes flicked around the small shop too quickly, like a man not browsing, but searching. "Good afternoon," he said, giving Mr. Larch a bright smile. "I was wondering if anything arrived for my aunt, Mrs. Humphreys." "She's passed on, Mr. Endicott," Larch replied, cautious. "You know that." "Yes, yes, of course," Endicott said, leaning on the counter as if in confidence. "But I thought perhaps there might have been a letter. She was expecting something. Legal papers, you know. Tedious business. I'd be happy to take it off your hands." Mr. Larch hesitated. If anything arrived, it would be for the constable or the family solicitor to manage. Endicott's smile flickered. "Well, I am the only living relation." "Even so," Larch said flatly. That evening, the postmaster found the drawer slightly ajar. The telegram was gone. At the same hour, Miss Marple sat in the vicarage drawing-room, her tea gone cold on the tray beside her. Rain tapped steadily against the glass, a comforting sound to some, but not tonight. She had received a call not an hour ago from poor Mr. Larch, his voice low and tight with worry. He hadn't said what he needed to show her, only that it was urgent and related to the late Mrs. Humphreys. And now, he was dead. They found him slumped behind the counter. The constable, red-faced and unsteady in the storm, muttered something about a weak heart. But Miss Marple saw the overturned drawer, the missing envelope, the scratches near the lock. Someone had been desperate. By the time the sun rose, the village was humming with whispers. 2 deaths in 3 days, both under strange circumstances. Miss Marple stood before the fireplace in her own parlour, wrapped in her shawl and staring into the embers. She didn't believe in coincidences, nor in conveniently weak hearts. She returned to Honeysuckle Cottage that afternoon, under pretense of fetching some belongings to be passed on to the solicitor. The house was silent, the smell of a lavender polish and dried roses still lingering. She moved with delicate precision, eyes noting every detail. The pair of pruning shears left on the windowsill, a scorched teacup in the sink, the faint indentation of a boot heel near the back door. In the drawing-room, she found the writing desk unlocked. She had expected it to be locked. Mrs. Humphreys had been meticulous. Inside, envelopes, calling cards, and, tucked into a diary, a key, small, brass, and rather old-fashioned. She turned it over in her hand thoughtfully. The diary was mostly dull. Tea with the vicar's wife, notes on the garden, occasional grumbles about the cold. But one entry stood out, only a few days before her death. C. came again, said he only wanted to talk. But I remember the summer of 32. I remember everything. I cannot allow the truth to come to light. Not after all this time. I must protect MC. Could it be Charles? But who was M? Miss Marple closed the book gently. Across the room, she noticed the photograph still absent from the side table, the same one she had taken from the kitchen drawer in the previous visit. It was perhaps the only image the widow kept on display. Had she removed it herself, or had someone else? That night, The post office was officially sealed, but Miss Marple received word from Thomas Fielding, the delivery boy. He'd seen someone around the back of the shop after hours, a tall man in a dark coat. Said he heard glass break, but thought it might have been the storm. She followed up with the telegraph office in Gresham Green, claiming a mix-up on a message. After much flutter and a bit of sweet persuasion, she learned the telegram had been sent from London, from a boarding house in Bloomsbury. No signature. Just the message. Do not trust C. The past is not buried. If anything happens to me, look inside the blue book. But it had arrived too late. Miss Marple returned to the cottage under cover of dusk. The key from the diary fit a narrow wall cabinet in the upstairs bedroom. Inside, dusty ledgers and a stack of blue-bound volumes. She flipped through each until one stood out. Bluebells of Devon, an old gardening book. Between pages 42 and 43, she found a folded letter, yellowed but carefully preserved. To be opened in the event of my death. If this is read, it means I am gone, and not of natural cause. Charles Endicott is not who he claims to be. In 1932, he was involved in the disappearance of Margaret Lane, my husband's ward. I kept the truth hidden all these years out of shame. She was pregnant. The child was his. He had promised to marry her. She vanished instead. He claimed she fled to France. But I knew better. I have kept a piece of her necklace, buried beneath the sundial, as proof. I fear he has returned for the inheritance. I cannot allow him to claim what he has stolen. R.H. Miss Marple sat still for a long time, the letter trembling slightly in her hand. The motive was forming, slow and grim. Margaret Lane. M. She returned to the garden. Rain had turned the earth to sludge, but the sundial stood firm, old stone, etched with moss. She dug carefully, slowly. Just beneath the surface, wrapped in oilcloth, she found it. A thin gold chain with a tiny enamel locket, blue as forget-me-nots. Inside the locket, a lock of auburn hair. The next morning, she found Charles Endicott at the Rose and Thistle, freshly shaved, suit pressed, breakfast untouched. "Miss Marple," he greeted, offering his usual smile. "Come to ask more questions, have you?" "Only one, Mr. Endicott," she said, setting the locket on the table. "Would you care to tell me what happened to Margaret Lane?" For a moment, he didn't blink. Then, the smile faltered. "Where did you find that?" "I think you know. She trusted you, didn't she? And when she discovered she was with child, she thought you'd do the right thing. But you had other plans, ambitions, a family fortune to inherit." "You have no proof," he said, but his voice was lower now, darker. "No? Then perhaps the letter your aunt wrote, the one she hid inside Bluebells of Devon, might interest the police." His eyes narrowed. "You're bluffing." "I rarely do," Miss Marple said gently. He rose sharply, knocking the chair back. His fists clenched as though he might lash out, then stopped himself. He straightened, took a breath, and forced a smile. "This is nonsense. Pure village gossip." "Of course," Miss Marple said, standing. "Do forgive me for interrupting your tea. I imagine a telegram will be arriving soon." Outside, the storm clouds were breaking, but the air was still thick with unease. She had no doubt the police would act. Not yet on murder, perhaps, but certainly on fraud. And, with a little luck, more would come to light. Yet something gnawed at her still. Mr. Larch's death. It had come too swiftly. If Charles had retrieved the telegram and silenced the postmaster, Why had he not destroyed the letter in the book? Unless he hadn't known about the blue book at all. She turned back toward the cottage with a sudden chill. Someone else had been searching too. Someone who knew about Margaret Lane. Someone who knew exactly where Rosalind Humphreys had hidden the truth, and they were still in St. Millicent. Chapter 3. The Guest Who Wasn't on the List. The bell above the iron gate rang once, sharp and brittle in the morning fog, as Inspector Walsh stepped into the grounds of Fernley Hall, boots crunching on the damp gravel. The old Endicott estate loomed ahead, flanked by sculpted yews and a tangled rose arbor gone to winter rot. Fernley had once hosted garden parties, carriages, cricket matches. Now it stood like a monument to faded grandeur, ivy-choked, shutter-eyed, and keeping secrets. Close to its chest, Walsh hadn't come on a hunch. He had come because Miss Marple had written him a letter. Not a dramatic one, just a polite note that read, "Dear Inspector, I thought you might find it interesting that the late Mrs. Humphreys's guest book has an unfamiliar name from the night of her death, one that doesn't appear on any of the village registries. I am sure this is quite the coincidence, but you know how curious coincidences can be." Inside the hall, the air smelled, faintly, of wax and old upholstery. Mrs. Thirlwell, the housekeeper, led the inspector to the morning room with a practiced air of resignation. She had worked there for nearly 30 years and wore her apron like armor. "The master's out riding," she said, "but he'll be back shortly. You're welcome to sit in the library until then." "Thank you," Walsh replied, though he made no move toward the wing she'd indicated. Instead, he turned to a low table in the entrance hall where the visitor logbook rested, leather-bound, gilt-edged, a relic of more formal times. He flipped it open, skimming the elegant loops and firm signatures. Charles Endicott had visited often, of course. Mrs. Humphreys had signed in twice over the past year. A few guests from the parish council, one from the Women's Literary Society, but then, between the usual familiar names, was a signature in dark green ink, E. Lane. The entry was dated the night before Rosalind Humphreys was seen. Gardening, 4:30 in the afternoon, but no one in the village knew of an E. Lane. Walsh narrowed his eyes. He had already read Miss Marple's summary of the letter hidden in Bluebells of Devon, the one implicating Charles in the disappearance of Margaret Lane. Was this visitor a relation, a daughter, or someone else entirely? By the time Miss Marple arrived at Fernley, the fog had thickened into a wet veil over the hills. She was greeted not by Walsh, but by young Miss Lydia Endicott, the lady of the house, niece to Charles, recently returned from finishing school in France. She was tall and willowy, her blonde hair pinned in a manner that tried too hard to seem effortless. "I'm afraid you've just missed Inspector Walsh," Lydia said, ushering Miss Marple in. "But I've made tea. Do stay." Miss Marple thanked her and settled into an armchair beside the fire, her eyes scanning the walls. Portraits of forgotten Endicotts gazed down in oil and shadow. A young woman on the far wall caught her eye, unlabeled, but wearing a locket nearly identical to the one unearthed beneath the sundial. "Your grandmother?" Miss Marple asked mildly. Lydia blinked. "No, that's Margaret, my father's ward. She vanished before I was born, but we keep her portrait because she was family, in a way." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "Striking resemblance." Lydia poured tea with a grace that spoke of expensive tutors and continental polish, but her hands trembled just slightly. The silence between them thickened. "You've met my Uncle Charles, of course," Lydia said at last. "What do you make of him?" Miss Marple smiled politely. He seems ambitious. Lydia's lips pressed into a flat line. He's more than that. He's persistent. When he wants something, he gets it. And if you're in the way, well, you aren't, for long. The words hung like frost on glass. Miss Marple tilted her head. Has he always been that way? No, Lydia said softly. Only since his return. He used to laugh more. Now he just watches, especially since Aunt Rosalind died. And do you believe it was natural causes? Lydia hesitated. No, but I don't think anyone will prove otherwise. Not without more. Miss Marple left shortly after, promising to return the next day. As she stepped outside, her boot caught on something protruding from beneath the rose trellis. She bent down. A scrap of heavy cardstock, damp, torn, part of a calling card. Only the lower portion remained, but the ink was still legible. 17 Rose Hill Court. Back in her cottage, she placed it beside her growing collection of clues. A map of London's Bloomsbury district lay unfolded across the table, and she found Rose Hill Court easily enough. A boarding house, according to the directory. She would write to them immediately. By noon the next day, a reply arrived, in the tight hand of a Mrs. Galbraith, the proprietress. Yes, we had an E. Lane staying here briefly last week. Young woman, auburn hair, mid-20s, quiet, paid in cash, left suddenly on Tuesday, said she was visiting family in the country but didn't say where, left a few items behind. Miss Marple tapped her finger on the page. Mid-20s, auburn hair. Margaret Lane had vanished nearly 25 years ago. The math wasn't hard. That evening, the vicar's wife delivered a tray of scones and gossip. I know it's terrible to say, she began, but I never quite believed Margaret simply ran off. She adored Rosalind. They were inseparable, like sisters. And Rosalind never recovered, truly. She withdrew. But I always thought, well, what if Margaret had a child? Someone must have known. Miss Marple smiled softly. I believe someone did. That night she sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The pieces were forming now, not a full picture yet, but enough to glimpse the outline. Margaret had disappeared after, becoming pregnant by Charles. Rosalind, for all her austerity, had loved her. Enough to hide the child, perhaps, enough to protect her legacy. And now, a young woman, E. Lane, had arrived in the village under another name, quiet, watching, looking for something, or someone. The next morning, the constable arrived with news. The grave beside the sundial had been dug up in the night. The necklace was gone. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the disturbed earth, her hands folded calmly, but her eyes, pale blue and unblinking, swept the scene with quiet ferocity. The ground had been turned carefully. No tool marks, no mess. Whoever had done it had known exactly where to dig, and they hadn't been in a hurry. A glove lay near the edge of the path. Fine leather. Women's. Miss Marple picked it up. Inside the lining, stitched in gold thread, E.L. That afternoon she visited Fernley Hall once more. Charles Endicott was away on some fabricated business in Brighton, leaving Lydia to entertain. You've seen the guest book? Miss Marple asked. Lydia hesitated. Yes. And the name E. Lane? A flicker of surprise. Yes. Uncle Charles was furious. He said it was someone playing a prank. Do you believe that? Lydia met her gaze. No. Then who was she? Lydia swallowed. She came to the kitchen door, said she'd made a mistake, that she thought Rosalind still lived here. She asked about the family. She was polite, almost frightened. I told her she had the wrong place. Did she leave anything behind? Lydia looked away. A brooch. I've kept it. I don't know why. She retrieved it from a drawer. A small cameo, ivory and gold, a woman's profile in relief. It matched the style of the necklace exactly. Miss Marple held it for a long moment. You saw something in her face, didn't you? She looked like the woman in the portrait, Lydia whispered. I thought I was imagining it, but I wasn't. Miss Marple stood. Thank you, my dear. I believe it's time someone had a proper talk with Mr. Endicott. As she stepped into the dusk, the air crackled with the scent of wood smoke and something heavier, secrets unearthed too soon. She hadn't walked 10 paces when someone called her name. It was young Thomas Fielding, red-faced and breathless. Miss Marple, they've found something, behind the church. She followed quickly, skirts gathered, heart steady. Behind the stone wall, in a patch of sodden earth, lay a small satchel. Inside, the necklace, a woman's passport, and a letter addressed to R. Humphreys, if I am too late. The passport name read Elizabeth Lane, age 26, born Cornwall, and the photograph was unmistakable. She had Margaret Lane's eyes. Chapter 4. The Will That Was Never Signed. The rain had returned, as though summoned by the weight of what had been found. In the dim light of the solicitor's office, papers rustled like dry leaves in autumn wind. Miss Marple sat in the corner, knitting quietly, her needles ticking softly, while the atmosphere inside was anything but calm. Mr. Hargreaves, the family solicitor for the Endicotts for more than 3 decades, stood stiffly behind his oak desk, spectacles low on his nose, and guilt creeping like ivy into the folds of his normally inscrutable face. I've told you, he said, voice tight with strain. There was a will, a new one. Mrs. Humphreys summoned me 3 weeks before her passing. She said she wished to make revisions, to include someone. But the document was never signed. It was never made official. Miss Marple looked up, eyes bright with something that bordered on amusement. But you did draft it? Yes, Hargreaves snapped, then caught himself. That is to say, I made notes, a preliminary draft, nothing binding, nothing filed. We never had the chance to finalize it. Curious, she murmured. Because the young lady in question, Miss Elizabeth Lane, said she was told there was a signed will, that it had been witnessed by your own clerk. At this, Hargreaves blanched visibly. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again like a fish gasping at low tide. My clerk? Miss Marple allowed the silence to fill the space between them. The rain drummed lightly on the high windows. Somewhere in the hall, a clock ticked, counting down the patience of truth. I see, she said softly. Then I wonder, Mr. Hargreaves, what might be the legal position of a solicitor who fails to report the destruction or concealment of a will. He didn't answer. Outside the solicitor's office, the village of St. Millicent felt heavier than usual. The fog had settled low again, hugging the hedgerows and stone walls, like a secret keeping itself close. At Honeysuckle Cottage, Rosalind Humphreys's rooms remained untouched since her death. Yet something about them had changed. It was as though the air knew what had been left undone. Miss Marple moved through the sitting room slowly, eyes taking in the careful arrangements. The clock stopped at 8:17. The teacup still on its saucer, now stained with time. Lydia Endicott had offered to help her go through the late widow's personal effects. Lydia was pale and thinner than before, her usual composure rattled by recent revelations. She had insisted on coming, said she wanted to know the truth at last. They opened the small writing desk together. Inside, the compartments held an orderly collection of papers, receipts, photographs, everything, it seemed, except the most important document, the will. There was one, Lydia said, voice quiet but certain. She told me she had rewritten it, that someone named Elizabeth was to inherit the cottage. She didn't say why, only that it was right. She was anxious about it, kept saying it had to be signed before the weekend. And yet, Miss Marple said, drawing a handkerchief over her fingertips as she delicately handled a sealed envelope addressed only with initials, there's no trace of it here. Curious. She lifted the envelope. The paper crackled with age, as though it had been tucked away long before it should have. Breaking the seal, Miss Marple unfolded a letter in Rosalind's distinct hand. If anything should happen to me before the new will is signed, I beg whoever finds this to see that Elizabeth is provided for. I have failed once before. I cannot bear to do so again. R.H. Miss Marple read it twice, then passed it to Lydia. She knew something might happen, Lydia whispered. She was afraid. Indeed, Miss Marple replied. But of whom? Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked alone to the churchyard, umbrella raised against the drizzle. She passed the grave of Rosalind Humphreys without pause and continued toward the chapel annex, where records of all the Endicotts, births, deaths, marriages, had been kept for over 2 centuries. Inside, she met the vicar, who had been waiting. You were right, he said, leading her to a narrow table, lit by a single lamp. The parish log shows that a Margaret Lane gave birth here in 1933. The child was registered under the name Elizabeth Rosalind Lane. Father not listed. And the sponsors? Miss Marple asked. One name only, the vicar said. Rosalind Humphreys. Miss Marple folded her hands. So she didn't merely protect Margaret, she raised her child, or arranged for it to be done. The vicar nodded. Rosalind would have done anything to keep a scandal from spreading, especially one that involved Charles. Miss Marple's mind turned over the possibilities. Rosalind had rewritten her will to include Elizabeth Lane, the child of Margaret, the ward she had once loved as a daughter, and whose ruin she had buried beneath decades of silence. Charles, already under suspicion for Margaret's disappearance, now stood to lose everything. And then Rosalind was dead. The will unsigned. The only proof, a solicitor who now seemed remarkably uneasy, and a clerk no one had seen for several days. Miss Marple took her tea alone that evening, a single candle flickering on the tray beside her as the wind began to rise. She reviewed the facts silently, knitting needles, clicking away. Someone had erased the new will, someone who had reason to ensure Elizabeth received nothing, someone who knew Rosalind's intentions and feared them. At 9 o'clock, there was a knock at her door. It was Inspector Walsh, raincoat damp and collar turned up. I've found something, he said, handing her a folded telegram from London. Hargreaves's former clerk, a Mr. Leonard Blythe, left for the continent 2 days ago. Ferry to Calais, no notice, no forwarding address. Indeed, Miss Marple said, a guilty conscience makes for a fast traveller. He was the second witness listed on Rosalind Humphreys's previous will, Walsh added. We checked the legal file. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Then he knew exactly what was at stake. Walsh hesitated. But I still don't understand the motive for Rosalind's death. If Charles was the primary heir under the old will, why not simply wait? She was elderly, unwell, Unless, Miss Marple said, voice low and sharp, Rosalind was threatening to do more than change the will, unless she was prepared to confess what Charles did to Margaret, a confession that would not only shame the family, but potentially implicate him in her disappearance. That's not inheritance, Inspector. That's motive. That night, the wind howled against the windows, and the village lamps flickered under the weight of storm clouds. In the drawing room of Fernley Hall, Charles Endicott sat before the fire, brandy in hand, eyes flickering toward the clock as though waiting for it to strike something other than the hour. When Lydia entered, he barely glanced at her. "I suppose you've heard," she said, crossing to the hearth. "They're looking for Leonard Blythe." Charles grunted. "Fool. Should have stayed gone." Lydia studied her uncle's face. "Why did you really come back, Charles? It wasn't to reconnect with Aunt Rosalind. You never cared for her, or for this place." Charles drained his glass. "I came back for what's mine. And if it isn't yours—" His eyes turned to steel. "Then someone's made a mistake. One I intend to correct." The next morning, Miss Marple received a package by post. The address was scrawled, the return mark foreign, Calais. Inside, a single folded page of legal stationery, marked with Hargreaves and Dent, solicitors. It was the final draft of Rosalind Humphreys' new will, unwitnessed, unsigned. But at the bottom, a handwritten note: "Will to be signed. Friday, 4 p.m. Witnesses arranged: L. Blythe, R. Hargreaves. Friday." The same day, she died. Miss Marple held the document carefully. The timing was no coincidence. Rosalind had been silenced before she could make her final act official. And now, the only man who could confirm it had vanished to another country. Yet even unsigned, the will said enough. Later that day, she visited Lydia at Fernley once more. The girl looked older already, drawn and pale. "I found something else," Lydia said, leading Miss Marple to a cabinet in the study. She pulled out a small notebook, Rosalind's private journal. Most of it was mundane until the final entry. Elizabeth arrived. "I knew the moment I saw her. Margaret's eyes. I must do what is right. I only hope I am not too late. If anything happens, the locket will be enough. The truth lies beneath the sundial. But I must also tell Lydia. She deserves to know who she is." Miss Marple closed the book slowly. "Who she is?" Lydia nodded. "There's more. A birth certificate for Elizabeth. But the mother's name isn't Margaret Lane." Miss Marple opened the folded page. The handwriting was careful, steady. Elizabeth Rosalind Lane, mother Lydia Endicott, born March 2nd, 1933. Miss Marple turned to her, the realization dawning like slow thunder. "You're not her niece." Lydia's voice cracked. "I'm her daughter." Chapter 5. Footprints on the ceiling. The shriek came just after midnight, shattering the quiet of Fernley Hall like a glass dropped in the dark. A desperate high-pitched sound that echoed through the long corridors and drew every soul in the house from their beds. Miss Marple, staying temporarily in the guest room at Lydia's insistence, had already been awake. She never slept deeply in houses where murder lingered. She rose at once, shawl over her shoulders, and followed the sound. It led to the east wing. Lydia stood at the threshold of the small nursery, one hand covering her mouth, the other clutching the edge of the doorframe. Her face had gone pale beneath the candlelight, and her eyes were fixed not on the cradle, nor the window swinging ajar in the storm's gust, but on the ceiling above. Miss Marple stepped in and looked up. There, on the plaster ceiling, were footprints, faint but unmistakable, muddy prints, narrow and arched, walking heel to toe, as though someone had strolled across the ceiling upside down. They disappeared near the far corner, vanishing just above the bookshelf. The vicar arrived seconds later, summoned from the nearby rectory by the clanging bell in the servants' corridor. His dressing gown fluttered behind him, and the rain streaked down his face like ink. Behind him came the cook, the maid, and eventually a bleary-eyed Inspector Walsh, who had been staying at the Rose and Thistle while inquiries continued. No one could explain it. "They're prints," the inspector muttered, candle raised. "They can't be, but they are." "The storm, perhaps," someone whispered. "Water damage, a trick of the eye." Miss Marple, standing quietly in the center of the room, cleared her throat. "They're real, and they're recent." She pointed to the smudged line of dirt that had dropped from one print and landed on the carpet, a narrow stain. Fine loam, not from the garden, but from the moor, the kind found beneath hedges, far from the pathways, fresh enough to smell faintly of crushed roots. "But how in God's name did someone walk across the ceiling?" the cook moaned. "They didn't," Miss Marple said. "Not literally." She crossed to the corner where the prints ended and peered up. The plaster had cracked in places, thin lines spidering outward like veins. One section, just above the shelf, had bowed slightly. "I'd like to see the attic," she said calmly. Reluctantly, the inspector fetched the butler, who produced a brass key from an old nail behind the pantry door. The attic staircase groaned under their steps. A heavy, mothy silence greeted them as they climbed. Dust thick in the air, wooden beams curving overhead like the ribs of some great, sleeping animal. The attic ran the length of the house, long and low and dark. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, some sealed, some spilling their yellowed contents. Old dresses, war medals, estate records. Rats scurried from the candlelight. Near the west corner, Miss Marple knelt. The floorboards there had been disturbed. A thin layer of loam clung to the edges, and in one spot, directly above the nursery, a loose panel had been replaced carelessly, not quite flush with the others. She lifted it, revealing a crawl space just wide enough for a grown man to lie prone. And in the plaster beneath, a clear break, wide enough to press boots through. "Someone climbed in here," Miss Marple said, voice low. They pressed their feet against the ceiling from above. It created the illusion that they walked across it from below. They meant to terrify. "But why?" asked Lydia, her voice still trembling. "To send a message," Miss Marple murmured, "or perhaps to frighten someone into silence." Back downstairs, the house was still whispering, the servants uneasy, the walls themselves seeming to listen. Miss Marple returned to the nursery and examined the footprints again. They were careful, she said, more to herself than the others. Clean enough to avoid detection, but just dirty enough to leave a trail for those who would understand. The kind of act that's half threat, half theater. Inspector Walsh sighed. So, someone snuck into the attic, planted the scene, then exited again. But how? There's no sign of forced entry. There wouldn't be, Miss Marple said. The attic door was locked from the inside. But perhaps it was never truly locked at all, only made to look. She turned to the butler. "Mr. Cresswell, has anyone besides staff had access to the attic key?" The man hesitated. "Not since Master Charles returned. He asked for it a fortnight ago to check on a family chest," he said. "I thought nothing of it. He returned it that same evening." "Did he?" Miss Marple said gently. "And did you test the lock after?" Cresswell's eyes narrowed. "No, madam. I suppose I didn't." That was all she needed to hear. Later that day, when the storm had eased to a soft drizzle, Miss Marple sat by the fireplace in the vicarage with a fresh pot of tea and her notebook spread out before her. The facts were aligning now, not neatly, but with enough clarity to make out the shapes beneath the fog. Charles had been in the house the day the new will was to be signed. He had reason to prevent it. He had means to manipulate the postmaster and opportunity to intercept the telegram. He had motive, strong enough to risk everything. But something still nagged at her. The footprints, though cunning, were not Charles's style. Too theatrical, too desperate. Charles preferred manipulation through charm, coercion, reputation. He wouldn't stoop to ghost stories and attic panels. So who would? She thought of Lydia. Smart, controlled, trained in discretion, but capable of emotion so deep it boiled over in silence. Elizabeth Lane, missing again, last seen near the churchyard after delivering her letter to Miss Marple. Had she been frightened off? Or worse? And then there was Mr. Hargreaves. The solicitor had fumbled every question, stammered under pressure, and now refused to return Miss Marple's calls. She paid him a visit the next morning. The office was shuttered. The sign turned inward. No note, no clerk. A neighbour leaned out her window. "Gone up to London, they say. Emergency matter." Left without a word. Suspicious, but perhaps predictable. Instead, Miss Marple visited the village archives. There, she found what she was looking for. Land records from 1932. A small cottage on the edge of the Endicott estate, registered to a M. Lane, purchased in cash and then mysteriously sold 2 years later. No forwarding address, no will, no burial. She traced her fingers along the inked signature. The handwriting was neat, controlled, but when compared to the note Rosalind left in her diary, "I must protect M." Miss Marple noticed something small, yet telling. The M in the signature of Mr. Lane curved in the exact same style as Rosalind's own. Margaret hadn't signed it. Rosalind had. Back at the cottage, Miss Marple pored through her collected papers once more. She retrieved Elizabeth's birth certificate, folded neatly inside a cloth wallet Lydia had given her days earlier. The document listed Rosalind as the child's godmother, but not her mother. Yet in the margin, nearly invisible under faded ink, was a scribbled correction. Adopted by R.H., guardianship assumed under private deed. Miss Marple's heart quickened. She hadn't just protected Elizabeth, she had raised her, and not only from love, but guilt. Because Margaret hadn't simply disappeared, she had been silenced, and someone, perhaps Rosalind herself, had buried the truth. That night, Lydia entered Miss Marple's room at the hall unannounced. Her face was pale, lips drawn. "I had to see you," she whispered. "I remembered something. From when I was a child, there was a room, locked, always locked, on the 3rd floor, and once I crept in behind Charles. He didn't see me. There was a trunk, and inside, a dress, covered in dirt, blood-stained." Miss Marple rose slowly. "Do you remember what else?" Lydia swallowed. "There was a necklace, the same one you found near the sundial. I never told anyone." Miss Marple placed her hand gently over Lydia's. "I believe you've just remembered where Margaret Lane truly died." Chapter 6. The Maid Who Remembered Too Late. The kettle had only just begun to whistle when the scream came, sharp and sudden, rising like a blade through the stillness of Fernley Hall. It wasn't the shriek of pain or terror but of memory, the cry of someone who had just seen something they'd long forgotten. Miss Marple rose at once, shawl already on her shoulders, knitting needles left mid-row in the basket beside the hearth. She moved swiftly and quietly through the old houses, winding corridors, drawn not by panic, but by a peculiar sense of knowing. Some things, when heard, speak directly to a woman's intuition. That cry had been one of them. It had come from the servants' wing, more precisely, from the small attic room belonging to Nora Dinn, the youngest maid. By the time Miss Marple arrived, Lydia was already at the top of the stairs, robe wrapped tightly around her and eyes wide with alarm. Nora stood trembling in the doorway, one hand still on the edge of the small writing desk by the window, her face pale and damp with cold sweat. She didn't speak as Miss Marple approached, only stared at the open drawer in the desk, where a single object lay, among bits of paper and an old postcard from Brighton. It was a button, not just any button, a small ivory one with a filigree border, stained dark at one edge and unmistakably antique, the kind often sewn onto the cuffs of women's dresses during the early 30s. "I know it," Nora whispered. "I remember it now." Miss Marple took the button gently in her gloved fingers. "Where from, dear?" "The West Wing," Nora said, voice distant. "Years ago. Before I left, I was only a child then, a helper. I brought a tray up one evening, to the 3rd floor, the old music room. No one ever used it, but I was told to bring a tray. I thought it was odd." She swallowed, hard. "When I opened the door, I saw her. Not clearly, just the edge of a woman's dress. She was lying on the floor. There was blood. This button, it had come off. I picked it up, but someone shouted, and I dropped the tray. Mr. Charles came running. He told me I was dreaming, that I'd hit my head. He gave me money, told me never to mention it, and I didn't, not until now." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Lydia, who said nothing. "That dress," Nora continued, staring at the button in Miss Marple's hand, "it was blue silk. I remember it clearly. I'd never seen fabric like it. I saw the necklace too, blue, like glass stars." Miss Marple nodded gently. "The same necklace found under the sundial. The same dress Lydia remembered from the locked room." "I never knew what happened," Nora whispered. "Not really. I left after that, but now it's all coming back." She began to weep, not loudly, but with the kind of quiet sobs that come from something long buried finally breaking the surface. Miss Marple led her gently back to the bed, then turned to Lydia. "She must not be left alone," she said. "Not tonight." "I'll stay," Lydia replied at once. Miss Marple looked back at the button in her palm. "This may be the final key." By morning, the mood in the house had shifted again. The staff were quieter than usual, their movements cautious, as if afraid of what else the walls might remember. Nora had risen early, despite Lydia's protests. She insisted she was fine, only shaken. Said she needed fresh air. She was last, seen just after breakfast, carrying a small basket to the herb garden behind the kitchen. By noon, she had vanished. The cook found her shawl snagged on the edge of the orchard gate, the basket upturned on the path, rosemary and thyme scattered like a forgotten prayer. The rest of the staff were questioned. No one had seen her leave. The police were called again. A search was organized, but the weather had turned. The mist was thick and wet, and the forest beyond the garden was a labyrinth of shadow and bramble. Miss Marple stood by the gate, one hand on the old stone post, her expression unreadable. She wouldn't have run, she said to Walsh, who had returned with a fresh notebook and a growing suspicion that this case was deeper than anyone had dared to believe. She had just remembered. She wanted to speak. She might have panicked, Walsh offered weakly. No, Miss Marple said. She was afraid, yes. But she wanted to do right. That was clear. She knelt, inspecting the earth beneath the gate. A narrow trail led from the broken herbs through the grass, then vanished into the leaves. But something had been dropped, a torn corner of paper, half a name visible. Abeth. She tucked it carefully into her handbag. That afternoon, the storm returned. Rain began to patter on the roof of Fernley Hall once more, steady and merciless. Miss Marple returned to the drawing room and requested the visitor logs again. She flipped back through the pages, noting every visitor in the last 6 months. One name caught her eye. E. Lonsdale. Not Elizabeth Lane, but close. She underlined the entry. That, she said aloud, is our missing thread. The name had appeared only once, 4 days before Rosalind Humphreys's death. She brought the name to Lydia, who paled. I know it, she whispered. She came to the door, asking for Rosalind. I turned her away. I thought it was just another solicitor or gossip seeker. She left no address. Miss Marple tapped the name again. E. Lonsdale. It was an alias, likely the name she used when she thought she might be watched. If she was trying to reach Rosalind again, if Rosalind had arranged to meet her. She never had the chance, Lydia finished. Miss Marple nodded. And now, 2 women who knew too much have vanished. She didn't say the third would be next, but Lydia understood. That evening, she searched Rosalind's desk again. This time she looked not for papers, but for something else, something that might explain Rosalind's final days. Hidden beneath a false bottom in the drawer was a slim, cloth-bound book, a diary. The last entries were haunting. Saw her again today. She's grown into Margaret's face. Elizabeth is her in every way. She wants the truth. I cannot tell her all, but I must tell someone. Before Charles stops me, he watches now. Even Lydia seems afraid. The house is no longer mine. Miss Marple closed the diary slowly. I believe she knew she wouldn't survive the week. The following morning, a fisherman down at the old brook reported a scrap of fabric tangled near the reeds. It matched Nora Din's apron, but the water held no body. She hadn't drowned. She'd been taken. Inspector Walsh ordered further searches. Miss Marple returned to the sundial, not to dig, but to stand, to think. She looked to the house, its shuttered windows, the rain streaking down the glass. Somewhere in there, someone had removed a will. Someone had staged a haunting. Someone had silenced a young maid. And that someone, she believed now, was not working alone. She had been wrong to think Charles was the only spider spinning this web. There was another. That night, as the house grew still, she wrote a single name in her notebook and underlined it twice. It wasn't Charles. It was someone no one suspected. Someone who lived behind locked doors and knew exactly which drawers to open. Chapter 7. The Portrait with Watching Eyes. It was the second thunderclap that woke Miss Marple. The first had rolled softly, like distant drums over the hills beyond St. Millicent, but the second cracked directly overhead, sharp and personal, rattling the shutters of Fernley Hall and shaking loose a century's worth of dust from its wooden bones. She rose from the narrow guest bed without hesitation, knowing better than to waste a storm. Lightning had a habit of illuminating more than just rooftops. She took a candle rather than switch on the electric lamp. Power was unreliable at best during these downpours, and moved through the upper corridor. The long gallery, where the ancestors of the Endicott line watched from their frames, greeted her in flickering half-light. Their painted eyes glimmered strangely in the candle's wake. But one pair of eyes caught hers and held them. The portrait of Margaret Lane. Miss Marple had passed it a dozen times in recent days. It hung slightly off-center from the others, as if trying to keep itself separate, aloof. Painted in her early 20s, Margaret was shown seated in the garden, one gloved hand resting lightly on her lap, the other trailing absent-mindedly through the grass. She looked directly at the viewer, not smiling, not quite solemn, watchful. Tonight, the painting looked different. The lightning flashed again, and Miss Marple saw it. A faint distortion in the upper left-hand corner, a ripple in the frame that should not have been there. She stepped closer, candle raised, and gently touched the edge. It shifted slightly under her finger. The portrait was hinged. Carefully, deliberately, she eased it outward. The wall behind was plaster, pale and cracked, but not solid. A small recess had been carved into the wood beneath the lath, no bigger than a letterbox, and inside, yellowed with time and folded in thirds, was a letter. She drew it out, with trembling fingers. The wax seal had broken long ago, and the paper was fragile enough to tear with a breath. She opened it slowly, eyes scanning each line. "My dearest Rosalind, if you are reading this, then something terrible has happened. I have left the cottage tonight to meet Charles. He says he wants to make things right, to discuss the child. But I do not trust him. I never truly have. I am writing this in case I do not return. If anything should befall me, let it be known. Charles. Endicott is not who he seems. He speaks with charm, but there is something darker underneath. He has lied to me and to you. If he harms me, I beg you to protect the child. Elizabeth must never know the truth of this night unless she is in danger herself. Forgive me. I was foolish to believe he ever loved me." Miss Marple stood motionless for a long time, the letter heavy in her hand. The room had grown colder, as though the storm outside had finally seeped through the old stone and timber. Margaret had written this on the night she disappeared. Not just a cry for help, but a declaration of fear. And someone, perhaps Rosalind, had hidden it behind her portrait, where only a true searcher might find it. She slipped the letter into her handbag and gently returned the portrait to its false resting place. As she turned to leave, the faint creak of a floorboard echoed from the far end of the gallery. She froze. "Is someone there?" she called softly. "Nothing." But the air felt disturbed, like a breath drawn too quickly. She returned to her room, locked the door, and placed the letter beneath her pillow. By morning the storm had passed, but the house remained dim and watchful. At breakfast, the table was quieter than usual. Charles had not returned from wherever he claimed to have gone. Lydia sat pale and distracted, pushing her toast about the plate. Miss Marple watched her carefully. "You haven't slept," she said gently. "No," Lydia replied, voice thin. "I kept thinking about Nora, about what she saw. She wasn't lying, was she?" "No, my dear," Miss Marple said. "She remembered something she was never meant to remember. And that is always dangerous in houses like this." Lydia looked up sharply. "You mean someone here took her?" "I believe so," Miss Marple replied. "And not only to keep her quiet." She said no more, but in her bag, the letter pressed against her side like a heartbeat. Later, that day, she visited Inspector Walsh at the police station. "You need to read this," she said, handing him the letter. He read it in silence, jaw tight. "You've had this how long?" "Since last night." It was hidden behind the portrait of Margaret Lane, likely placed there by Rosalind herself. Walsh sat back, exhaling. "If we can prove this was written before Margaret disappeared—" "It was," Miss Marple said calmly. "The paper, the ink, it matches other letters from the same time, and the language is unaltered. No revision, no attempt to protect anyone's legacy. It was meant to be hidden, not staged." Walsh rubbed his brow. "And you believe Charles killed her that night?" "I believe," Miss Marple said, "that Margaret Lane went to meet a man she feared and never returned, that she was silenced, and I believe that Rosalind knew and spent the rest of her life hiding that knowledge, protecting Elizabeth from the truth, until it became too dangerous to keep buried." Walsh nodded slowly. "I'll file this quietly." Miss Marple stepped out into the damp air, the scent of wood smoke and turned earth heavy around her. The village looked the same as ever, quiet, modest, full of closed curtains and half-finished stories. But now she saw it differently. She saw the lines of fear etched into old stone, the shadows behind twitching lace. People had known, or guessed, but no one had spoken. She passed the old bookshop on her way back to Fernley Hall and stopped suddenly. In the display window, a small blue book, Bluebells of Devon, rested beneath a card marked Estate Sale, items from Honeysuckle Cottage. It hadn't been there yesterday. Inside, she found Mr. Weller, the bookseller, thumbing through ledgers. "Excuse me," she said, "where did you get that?" "The blue one?" he asked, nodding toward the window. "Brought in this morning. A young man, didn't give a name, said he was clearing out a cottage, didn't think it was worth much." She stepped to the counter. "Did he say where he was going?" Weller shrugged. "Left on foot, toward the station." Miss Marple turned without another word, stepping quickly into the street. Her mind was moving faster than her feet. Someone had come back to clean up what had been missed, and not just by accident. That book had once held the key to Margaret's secret. Someone feared what else it might contain. Back at Fernley Hall, the air felt heavier than before. She climbed to the long gallery once more and stood before the portrait again. This time, she didn't open it. Instead, she whispered, "You've done your part. Now it's time for the rest of us." She turned to leave and stopped. At the far end of the gallery, nailed crookedly to the wall, was a new painting. It hadn't been there the day before. A landscape, a river, and on the bank, half concealed by brush, a woman in blue. Margaret. Not imagined, not dreamed, but Margaret, older, painted from memory by someone who had seen her since. Miss Marple stepped closer. In the bottom corner, almost imperceptibly scratched into the paint, were initials, L.E. Lydia Endicott. Chapter 8. A Whisper from the Dead. The wind returned to St. Millicent in the small hours, not as a blustering gale, but as a slow, sorrowful moan that curled beneath doors and whistled through keyholes like the breath of something long buried. At Fernley Hall, it stirred curtains and sent firelight flickering against the portraits lining the long gallery. It was in this uneasy hush that Miss Marple sat once more before the portrait of Margaret Lane, now fully certain that Margaret's death had not been a tragic accident, or even a crime of passion, but a slow, deliberate silencing, plotted in secrecy, and born of betrayal. Lydia had not returned since that afternoon. After the discovery of her initials beneath the painting of Margaret on the riverbank, painted in a style far too confident to be dismissed as a hobby, Miss Marple had gone looking for her. But the girl's room had been empty, her bed untouched, her nightdress still folded neatly on the chair. She had vanished without a word. At 2:30 in the morning, Miss Marple stood at the top of the servants' staircase, listening. A soft creak carried up from below, the creak of weight on floorboards that no breeze could explain. She descended in silence, stocking-footed, one hand resting on the rail, and followed the sound down to the old study, the one that had belonged to Rosalind Humphreys. The door was ajar. Inside, a small oil lamp burned low on the desk. Beside it, a stack of journals, leather-bound, brittle with age, but carefully preserved. Miss Marple stepped forward and pulled the top one free. It was dated 1932. She turned the pages slowly, her eyes sharp, despite the dim light. The handwriting was unmistakable. Rosalind's, tidy, measured, but with the occasional flourish of someone who had once written for affection, not record-keeping. Early entries concerned the estate, village gossip, and Charles's return from university. Then, in late spring, the tone changed. May 14th, 1932. Charles and Margaret were walking together again today. He's far too familiar with her, though he pretends indifference in front of others. I warned her not to encourage him, but she laughed, said he was harmless. I am not so sure. There's something in the way he watches her. June 3rd. I saw Margaret crying in the garden after supper. She said nothing was wrong, but I know better. That night, I found a note in her room. He promised me we'd leave together. Charles, it must be. I cannot allow this. Miss Marple drew a breath. Outside, the wind sighed against the stone like a voice caught in the past. June 20th. Margaret is with child. She came to me in tears. Charles will not answer her letters. He denies everything. I offered to send her away to a cousin in Devon, but she refused. She says she will raise the child herself. She is brave, but so young. I fear what Charles may do if she presses him. July 5th. I overheard Charles speaking to someone in the orchard. I believe it was Hargreaves. They were discussing how to be rid of a nuisance. I confronted Charles the next morning. He laughed, told me I read too many Gothic novels, but I saw his eyes. There was something dead in them, something cruel. Miss Marple's hand tightened around the journal. She turned another page. August 10th. Margaret has disappeared. She left the house late that night to meet someone. Charles claims she went to London, but she would never have gone without telling me. I've searched the grounds. Nothing. Only her necklace, buried beneath the sundial. I found it by accident, when the dog dug near the roses. I buried it deeper. I do not know why. Guilt or fear. August 14th. I cannot prove what happened. No one will believe me, but I know. I know. Charles did something to her. He's too calm, too ready to take over the accounts. I've made arrangements. I've taken the child, Elizabeth, under my care. She must never know what happened to her mother, not unless it becomes absolutely necessary. The next few entries grew more erratic. Notes about the estate, vague comments about the baby, and then one final entry, more scrawl than sentence. If I am silenced, let the truth be found, not just for Margaret, but for the child, for the name she never got to carry. Miss Marple sat back slowly, letting the silence settle. Again, it was all there. The affair, the betrayal, Charles's cold abandonment. and now, possibly murder. Hargreaves had been involved from the beginning, at least as a conspirator, and Rosalind had hidden it all, not from cowardice, but to protect Elizabeth, to preserve what was left of Margaret's legacy. She heard the door shift behind her and turned. Lydia stood in the doorway, soaked from the rain, her coat clinging to her shoulders, hair plastered to her temples. Her eyes were rimmed with red, but she stood tall, resolute. "I went to the cottage," she said softly. "Honeysuckle. I don't know why. I needed to feel close to her." "Margaret?" Miss Marple asked gently. Lydia nodded. "I've always felt her, watching, not haunting, but waiting. I knew something was wrong when I was a girl, but no one would say her name. And then Charles came back, took over. Everyone deferred to him, even Aunt Rosalind at first." Miss Marple stood, approached her slowly. "Did you know she kept a diary?" "I suspected," Lydia said, "but I didn't know where. When I saw the painting of Margaret, her eyes, I remembered the old drawer in the study. I thought, maybe—" She looked down. "I left the lamp burning. I should have stayed." "You've done more than most," Miss Marple said kindly. "But now we must act." That morning she returned to Inspector Walsh with the journal. He was grim but steady. It was enough to reopen the case, enough to bring Hargreaves in for questioning. Charles, however, had vanished. "No one's seen him since Tuesday," Walsh said. "We'll put a notice out on the trains. He can't get far." But Miss Marple wasn't so sure. She spent the afternoon at the vicarage, penning a letter, not to the police, not to any court, to Elizabeth. "My dear child," it began, "you have been searching for the truth. So have I. It may hurt to read what I write, but I believe it will hurt more never to know it." When she finished, she sealed it with wax and handed it to Lydia. "She should hear it from someone who cares," she said. At dusk, as the rain returned in soft silver threads, Miss Marple walked back toward Fernley Hall. But before she reached the path, a figure stepped from the hedgerow, thin, gaunt, and trembling. Nora. Her face was drawn with fear and fatigue, but she was alive. "I've been hiding," she whispered. "They chased me. I thought he meant to kill me. I saw him dragging something, a sack, toward the well." Miss Marple took her hand. "You're safe now, dear, but we must act quickly." She led Nora to the vicarage, then returned with Walsh and a constable. The well stood behind the old gardener's shed, moss-covered, crumbling. They lowered a lantern on a rope. What it illuminated made them all step back. Not a body, but bones. A woman's bones, long buried, wrapped in remnants of blue silk. Miss Marple closed her eyes. Margaret Lane had been found, and now there could be no more lies. Chapter 9. The Garden Path to Murder. It was just past midnight when Miss Marple stepped out into the garden, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and lilacs, and the moon hidden behind a gauze of slow-moving clouds. The gravel of the old path crunched softly beneath her shoes, the only sound in the stillness. To any watching from the windows of Fernley Hall, she might have appeared as a harmless old woman out for an evening stroll, a creature of habit, returning to the well-trodden paths of memory. But Miss Marple had never been harmless, not when she knew the truth. Margaret Lane's bones had been pulled from the old well behind the gardener's shed that afternoon. Though time had worn away the flesh, the blue silk still clung to the frame like memory. Charles Endicott had not been seen since. His room had been found open, the wardrobe empty, his traveling case gone, but Miss Marple didn't believe he had fled the village. Men like Charles didn't run from consequences. They waited for them to be buried. Miss Marple stopped at the edge of the path, where the stone sundial stood, its moss-covered face bathed in the faint glow of the lantern she carried. She set it down slowly, almost reverently, then reached into her pocket and produced a thin silver locket. Margaret's, the one found buried beneath this very sundial, wrapped in oilcloth, like a secret too fragile for daylight. She placed it carefully atop the dial, then stepped back into the shadows and waited. The house was still behind her. The trees rustled softly, and somewhere beyond the garden wall, an owl called once and fell silent. Then a movement, quick, furtive, a figure emerging from the hedgerow near the arbor. Miss Marple did not shift, did not blink. The lantern light caught the flash of a pale coat. The figure moved toward the sundial, hesitated, then reached for the locket. "Such a pretty thing, isn't it?" Miss Marple's voice cut through the dark like the snap of a twig. The figure froze. Charles turned slowly, his face sharp with a shadow of defiance. "You always were fond of dramatics, Miss Marple. And you, Mr. Endicott," she said, stepping forward, "were always fond of control. But the trouble with secrets is they tend to bloom, rather like roses. No matter how deep you bury them, the roots remember." He glanced down at the locket in his hand, then tossed it back onto the dial with a sneer. "Do you really think this nonsense matters now? Rosalind is dead. Margaret is dead. No jury in England will convict on a pile of old bones and dusty letters." "I don't need a jury," Miss Marple said softly. "I only need you." Charles laughed, the sound bitter and hollow. "And what exactly do you think you've done? Set a trap? Lured me here with a child's bauble?" "Not just the bauble," she replied. "The lie, too." His eyes narrowed. "What lie?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "The one I've been telling everyone in the village since noon, that Rosalind's solicitor returned from France with a final, witnessed copy of her new will, that Elizabeth is now the legal heir to Fernley Hall, that the law, at last, is on her side." There was a pause, only seconds, but long enough. Charles's face changed. Just a flicker. The mask faltered, and Miss Marple saw it. The fear. "You're lying," he said quietly. "Am I?" she replied. "Then why are you sweating, Charles? It's quite a cold night." He took a step toward her, hands clenched. "I should have dealt with you when I had the chance." "But you didn't," Miss Marple said, unshaken. "You couldn't, because even you know better than to murder a harmless old spinster in the family garden." The sound of footsteps echoed from the drive. Boots on gravel, purposeful, drawing nearer. Miss Marple didn't turn. She kept her eyes on Charles. "You see, I wasn't alone tonight. Inspector Walsh has been following you since dusk. He saw you leave the house. He saw you come here. And now he's heard everything you've said." Charles stepped back, eyes darting toward the hedgerow, but the inspector was already emerging, pistol drawn, an expression grim. "Don't bother, Mr. Endicott," he said. "You're done." Charles said nothing. His shoulders sagged slightly, then he straightened. "You've no proof I killed Margaret. You've no proof I touched Rosalind." "I think we have enough," Walsh replied. "The body, the journal, the letter from Margaret, your fingerprints on the broken panel above the nursery. And now this." He gestured toward the sundial. "But even without all that, you just confessed in front of a witness." Charles's face crumpled, the rage surfacing at last. "She was going to ruin everything," he hissed. she wouldn't let it go. She couldn't just leave it buried. "You mean Margaret?" Miss Marple said softly. "Or do you mean Rosalind? Or Nora? Or Elizabeth?" He looked at her then, truly looked, and for the first time, there was something like recognition, a quiet, deadly respect. "You're cleverer than you look," Miss Marple smiled. "Most of us are." Later, after Charles had been taken away in handcuffs and the garden was quiet once more, Walsh remained beside her as the moon broke through the clouds, illuminating the sundial fully. "He almost got away with it," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "Most men like him do. Charm, inheritance, and a gift for lying. But in the end, it's never the big things that catch them. It's the little ones." Walsh looked down at the locket. "The lie about the will." "Partly," Miss Marple replied, "but mostly the garden path." He frowned. "Rosalind walked that path every morning," she explained. "She never left the sundial without brushing off the moss. Habit, she said. But after her death, the moss grew back unevenly, except for the spot where the locket was found. Someone had disturbed the earth before I did. Someone who knew it was there, and that someone wasn't Rosalind. It was Charles. He knew where Margaret had been buried, because he was the one who put her there." She sighed. But the real mistake was thinking no one would remember. Walsh studied her a long moment. "You ever think about retiring, Miss Marple?" "Every morning," she said, "but crime keeps spoiling my breakfast." And with that, she turned and walked slowly back up the garden path toward the house, the night behind her echoing not with death, but with justice finally spoken aloud. Chapter 10. What the vicar's wife overheard. The village of St. Millicent had never truly known silence, only pauses between the steady murmur of gossip and the rustle of hedgerows. But after Charles Endicott's arrest, the hush that descended was something different. It had weight to it. It settled over the church pews, clung to the post office walls, crept into the parlor of every widow with a telephone. People lowered their voices now, not out of politeness, but fear. Because if a man like Charles, well-dressed, well-born, and above suspicion, could murder and bury a girl like Margaret Lane in their midst, then who else might they have overlooked? It was just after evensong when Mrs. Alderton, the vicar's wife, knocked on Miss Marple's door. The knock was light, uncertain, and she nearly turned to leave before Miss Marple opened it herself, spectacles on and shawl wrapped tightly against the evening chill. "Do come in, dear," Miss Marple said, as if she'd been expecting her. "You've something to tell me, haven't you?" The vicar's wife paused in the threshold, cheeks flushed. "I'm not sure it's important. It's probably nothing at all. Just something I heard. A bit of nonsense, I thought, but with everything happening, even the smallest thread can unravel a very large tapestry," Miss Marple said kindly, leading her into the parlor, where the fire crackled low and the scent of chamomile drifted from the teapot. Mrs. Alderton sat, gloved, hands clasped tightly on her lap. She was not a dramatic woman by nature. Quiet, dependable, her life measured out in hymns and sponge cakes, which made her visit all the more curious. "It was last winter," she began, "around Christmas. I was delivering some knitted shawls to Honeysuckle Cottage. Rosalind had organized them for the shelter in Gresham Green. I went a bit early, and when I came to the door, it was slightly open. Just ajar. I wasn't eavesdropping, I swear it, but I heard voices from inside, raised, urgent. One was Rosalind's, the other, I think it was Hargreaves, the solicitor." Miss Marple leaned forward, ever so slightly. Go on. They were arguing, Mrs. Alderton said, not shouting, but sharply. Rosalind said something like, "You made me bury her once, I won't do it again." And he, Mr. Hargreaves, he said something about consequences, about everything unraveling if the truth came out, that it would destroy the family name. Missy Marple's eyes narrowed. "And you didn't tell anyone?" Mrs. Alderton shook her head, mortified. "It wasn't my business. I thought perhaps she was talking about some old family matter, inheritance, or a scandal. But now you realize she meant Margaret." Mrs. Alderton nodded. "I do, and I think she meant to change her will because of it, because of something she learned, maybe even something he confessed." Miss Marple poured tea, silent in thought. The timeline was shifting, subtly but crucially. The assumption had been that Charles alone had orchestrated the murder, with Hargreaves as a passive accomplice or, at most, an intimidated enabler. But if Rosalind had known the solicitor's role in Margaret's death, really known, then perhaps the roots of the crime were deeper than anyone suspected. "What you've shared," Miss Marple said gently, "is more valuable than you know. Would you mind if I shared it with Inspector Walsh?" Mrs. Alderton hesitated, then nodded. "If it helps." Later that evening, Miss Marple walked to the vicarage through the fog, wrapped tightly in her coat and thoughts. She requested Walsh meet her in the vestry, away from the ears of the curious. She heard Hargreaves, Miss Marple said, admit to helping conceal Margaret's death. Walsh rubbed a hand down his face. "So we were wrong to think of him as just complicit." "Very wrong," Miss Marple said. "You'll need to bring him in, but do so quietly. I think he knows the noose is tightening, and men like Hargreaves rarely wait for it to close." By morning, the solicitor's office was locked. By afternoon, it was empty. The landlady at his lodgings claimed he had left that morning, bag in hand, claiming a funeral in Bristol. She remembered because he'd asked her to forward any letters to a postbox, not a house, not a solicitor's office, a box. Miss Marple sat in the vicarage, tea cooling beside her, staring at the fire as Lydia stood nearby, holding Rosalind's diary. "I don't understand," Lydia said. "Why would he help Charles cover it up? It wasn't his crime." Miss Marple took a long breath. It was, in a way, not the murder itself, but the silence after. Rosalind trusted him, likely called him for help when she realized Margaret was gone. Perhaps he even helped her bury the necklace. Perhaps he warned her what would happen to the Endicott name if the truth came out. Solicitors often see themselves as protectors of family legacy, but when that legacy is built on secrets— He became a gatekeeper, Lydia finished, and then a conspirator. Precisely. That evening, a telegram arrived. Not from Hargreaves, from Elizabeth. She would arrive the next morning. She had received Miss Marple's letter and wanted to know the truth. "She deserves to know all of it," Miss Marple said. Walsh nodded. "And she will. But we need Hargreaves first." "He'll come back," Miss Marple murmured. "They always do. There's always one more paper to burn." At dusk, Miss Marple returned to Honeysuckle Cottage one last time. The keys still worked. Inside, the air was stale with grief. Dust clung to every surface, and the fireplace held only the ghost of a flame long gone. She walked to the desk, where Rosalind had kept her ledgers, and opened the drawer. Inside, a letter, unsent, addressed to Elizabeth. "My dearest girl," it read, "I know I have failed you in more ways than one. I could not protect your mother, but I have tried to protect her memory. And you. The day she died, I begged him to tell the truth. He refused, and I kept his secret, believing I was preserving peace. But peace built on silence is never real. If you are reading this, then perhaps justice is finally finding its way to us. Miss Marple folded the letter, eyes heavy. A knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Hargreaves standing there, rain clinging to his coat and spectacles fogged. "I knew you'd be here," he said softly. This place always suited Rosalind. It had gentleness. "You've come to confess," Miss Marple said. "No," he replied. "I've come to collect something I left behind." She stepped aside, and he walked past her, into the study. But when he reached the desk, Inspector Walsh emerged from the shadows, revolver raised. Hargreaves stiffened. "Of course. Another trap." Miss Marple stood quietly. "Only the truth, Mr. Hargreaves. That's the only trap I've ever laid." The solicitor looked at her, then at the fireplace. "I didn't kill her. That was Charles. But I let it happen, and worse, I let it disappear." "Why?" He turned back. "Because I loved Rosalind. And I thought, if the truth came out, she'd break. She already blamed herself. I thought I was sparing her. But she never forgave me." Miss Marple didn't smile. "You weren't sparing her. You were sparing yourself." Hargreaves said nothing more. The next morning, Elizabeth arrived, her eyes so like Margaret's it made Lydia weep. They read the letters together in the garden. By afternoon, the sundial had been scrubbed clean, the necklace polished and placed in Elizabeth's hands. The garden bloomed in silence. But as Miss Marple turned to leave, Lydia caught her arm. "There's one more thing," she whispered. "In Rosalind's diary. The last entry, it wasn't dated." She handed Miss Marple the page. "I believe someone else knows. Someone closer than I thought. If I am gone before the will is signed, do not trust the woman with the blue scarf. She knows too much." Miss Marple read it, and for the first time in weeks, her hand trembled. Chapter 11. The Confession in Candlelight. The storm rolled back in, just after 7 o'clock, dragging a curtain of rain across the moor and beating the windows of Fernley Hall in slow, relentless pulses. Thunder growled distantly, as if the hills themselves were warning what the night might bring. Inside, the great manor flickered with candlelight. The power had gone an hour earlier, and the generator, unused since the war, had sputtered out with a final wheeze and the scent of scorched oil. Miss Marple did not mind. Candlelight had always suited truth. It softened lies and sharpened confessions. She moved slowly through the drawing room, placing candles in sconces with a deliberate hand, then lit the fire herself with a long taper, crouching before the hearth with surprising ease for a woman of her years. The flames licked to life, illuminating the wood-paneled walls and casting shadows upward into the portrait frames. Elizabeth sat near the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the firelight catching the auburn in her hair. Margaret's hair. She hadn't spoken much since arriving that morning. But now, as the storm grew louder, she turned toward Miss Marple with a quiet voice. "She knew someone would try to stop her," she said. "Rosalind, she wrote it down. She knew someone close was hiding something." Miss Marple nodded slowly. She suspected a second accomplice, not Charles, someone else, someone inside the house, someone who had access to the study, the will, the diary, someone she trusted. Elizabeth looked up, her eyes dark with the weight of history. The woman with the blue scarf. That's what the entry said. Miss Marple turned her head toward the doorway. "And you're wearing one tonight, Lydia." Lydia had been standing in the hall, unnoticed until then, hands resting on the balustrade, face unreadable. The scarf at her throat was silk, powder blue, knotted carelessly, but precisely. Her expression didn't change. "I wondered when you'd say something," she said softly. Miss Marple gestured to the chair near the fire. "Would you sit?" Lydia stepped into the room, unhurried, her heels barely touching the carpet as she lowered herself into the chair. Elizabeth sat back, watching. "You knew Rosalind was planning to change her will," Miss Marple said, not accusing, merely stating, "You knew she meant to leave Fernley to Elizabeth, not you." "I didn't care about the house," Lydia replied. "Not really," Miss Marple's eyes glinted. "But you did care about the truth, and you were afraid of it, because you weren't just her niece. You were her daughter." Lydia blinked once, then nodded. "She told me when I was 17, she said, that I was Margaret's child, that she'd taken me in because she couldn't bear to see me raised by strangers. She said it was the right thing to do, that she'd raised me to honor Margaret. And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "you never forgave her." Lydia's voice cracked. "Because she lied. For years. I thought I was part of the family, an Endicott. I thought I belonged. Then suddenly I wasn't. I was the shame they buried, the reminder of everything Charles had done. Rosalind loved me, but she was ashamed of me." "You kept her secret," Elizabeth said, voice quiet, trembling. "I didn't want to," Lydia said. "I wanted her to tell the truth, but she kept delaying, always after the will is signed, or once Charles is dealt with. And her hands clenched. "I read her diary," she whispered. "She'd left it in the study, unlocked. She wrote about Margaret, about you. She said she wanted you to have the house, that she wanted to give you the name she'd denied you. Everything." Elizabeth's face went still. "She wasn't giving it to me," Lydia continued. "She was giving it back to you." Miss Marple sat down slowly. The flames in the hearth cast long, unsteady shadows across the floor. "And that," she said, "was the moment you decided to act." Lydia looked up sharply. "I didn't kill her." "I don't think you did," Miss Marple said. "But I think you found the will after she died, and I think you destroyed it." Lydia's breath caught. "You were the last to see her alive," Miss Marple continued. "That evening, you brought her tea, and when she didn't come down for supper, you were the one who found her, or claimed to. You had the perfect opportunity. The diary was still on the desk. The will was nearby, and you were furious. Lydia began, but her voice failed her. "You loved her," Miss Marple said gently, "and you hated her." A long silence filled the room. Outside, rain slashed against the windows. The fire crackled. "I burned it," Lydia said finally. "The will. Not out of greed. I swear to you, I wanted her to choose me. Not out of guilt. Not because I was Margaret's daughter, but because I was her daughter. I thought if I destroyed the will, she'd rewrite it again, properly, with me in it." Elizabeth said nothing. Lydia's voice shook. "But then she died. Just like that. No warning. I didn't even have time to speak to her again, to say I was sorry." "And the diary?" Miss Marple asked. "I hid it. I was going to burn that too, but I couldn't. It felt like killing her again." Elizabeth stood slowly, walked to the hearth. She knelt, reached into her coat, and placed something on the mantel. The letter Rosalind had written to her, unsent. Lydia stared at it. "She loved you," Elizabeth said. "Not because she had to, because she chose to. The fire danced between them, warm and flickering. "I didn't want to lose her," Lydia whispered. Miss Marple's voice was kind but firm. "You already had. When you destroyed that will, you destroyed what she was trying to build. A chance at redemption, at truth." Lydia buried her face in her hands. There was no triumph in the room, no satisfaction. Only the quiet ache of old secrets laid bare. Miss Marple stood. "There is one thing more." Elizabeth turned. "What?" Miss Marple picked up the candle from the mantel and carried it across the room. She gestured toward the bookshelf near the hearth. She wrote a second copy of the will. Not finalized, not signed, but she had it drafted, and she kept it. She knelt, lifted the bottom panel of the bookshelf with surprising deftness, and reached inside. From the recess, she pulled a folded document, tied with string and wax. "The solicitor's clerk had hidden this," Miss Marple said. "But when he fled, he tried to recover it. Too late. I recovered it first." She handed it to Elizabeth. Lydia stared at the floor. "She gave it to you," Elizabeth said, "even after everything." Miss Marple looked at her, not because she loved one of you more than the other, but because Margaret never had the chance to raise you. Rosalind was giving that back. The firelight flickered higher, then settled. From outside, a knock at the front door. Inspector Walsh, punctual as ever. Elizabeth took Lydia's hand before anyone could move. "You'll tell the truth?" "I will," Lydia whispered. "I promise." Miss Marple stepped back as Walsh entered, rain beading on his coat. He took in the scene with a single glance, then nodded. "Everything all right?" "It is now," Miss Marple said. "The past has spoken." But even as she said it, her eyes narrowed, because one thing still lingered, unanswered. If Lydia hadn't killed Rosalind, and Charles hadn't been in the house, then who had? Chapter 12. Secrets buried with her. It was raining again, a grey, sweeping rain that blurred the graves in St. Millicent's churchyard into silhouettes, slanted stones, crosses leaning like tired men, angel wings lost in lichen. The wind curled around the crypts and whispered through the yews like voices carried from another century. In the far corner, beneath the weathered bell tower, a freshly turned grave stood stark and bare, its soil darker than the rest. The rain did not soften. It seemed to resist absorption, as if the earth itself refused to swallow what had been buried. Miss Marple stood beneath her black umbrella, the tips of her sensible shoes just touching the edge of Rosalind Humphreys's grave. She had come alone. There had been a service, of course, quiet and proper, but today was not about mourning. Today was about answers. She looked down at the grave, then slowly turned as footsteps approached. From the church path emerged Elizabeth Lane, wrapped in a long wool coat, her eyes shadowed, not by grief, but by the heaviness of truth, newly understood. Close behind her, Inspector Walsh followed, collar turned up against the rain. "Thank you for coming," Miss Marple said without turning. Elizabeth nodded. "You said there was more." "There always is," Miss Marple replied. "In mysteries, as in gardens, what's buried tends to grow." She gestured toward the grave. Rosalind was not simply a woman burdened with guilt. She was a keeper of secrets, and not just Margaret's. Walsh frowned. "I thought we'd uncovered everything. The truth about Margaret's death, Lydia's parentage, the forged will, Charles's role." Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly toward the church. "All the threads are visible now, but the knots, they've yet to be untied." She knelt beside the grave, brushing her hand gently across the soil. Rosalind wrote in her diary quite clearly about the night Margaret disappeared. She believed Charles killed her, but in the final entry, dated just hours before her own death, she mentioned someone else, a woman, the woman with the blue scarf. Elizabeth glanced at Walsh. We assumed she meant Lydia. As did I, Miss Marple said, until I remembered something Rosalind once said to me years ago, long before this ever began. She called Lydia my wildflower child, delicate, unpredictable, and brave. But she never described her as refined, and Rosalind prized refinement. She hated vulgarity, but in the diary, she describes the scarf as a vulgar blue. That wasn't a judgment about the girl, it was about the style. Walsh straightened. You're saying she didn't mean Lydia? No, Miss Marple said quietly. She meant Nora Dinn. Elizabeth's breath caught. But Nora vanished. She was found, barely alive. She reappeared, Miss Marple said. Yes, but she never told us everything. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the far end of the cemetery. A figure stood just beyond the wall, half-shadowed beneath a dripping oak tree. It was Nora. She came back because the lie was too much to bear, Miss Marple said, but she never told the full truth. Until now. Nora stepped forward slowly, her eyes downcast. She clutched a small notebook in her hand, worn at the edges. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse. She told me to take it. Rosalind, she said, if anything happened to her, I had to give it to someone. I was afraid. After what happened with Charles, I thought it would be safer if I ran, but I didn't run far enough. Miss Marple took the notebook, opened it gently. Inside, Rosalind's precise handwriting. There is one more secret, one more death. Not Margaret's, mine. If I am gone, it will not have been by natural cause. Miss Marple looked up. She was poisoned. Walsh stiffened. We didn't find any trace. You wouldn't, Miss Marple said. Not with modern compounds. Not in an old woman with a weak heart. But she knew. She wrote it here. She says, I saw the teacup. I didn't drink. I poured it into the hyacinths. Nora reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small cloth bundle. Inside, a porcelain teacup, cracked at the rim. The base was stained a strange, pale green. She made me hide it, Nora said. Said it was for protection. Miss Marple's voice was calm. Someone meant to kill her, not for Margaret's death, but for what she knew, for what she was about to reveal. Walsh was already writing, and that someone wasn't Charles. No, Miss Marple said. Charles was a coward, an opportunist. He let Margaret die. But Rosalind, she was murdered. Elizabeth stepped forward, her voice shaking. Who? Miss Marple's answer was soft. Mrs. Alderton. There was silence. The vicar's wife? Walsh asked, stunned. She's not the woman she seems, Miss Marple said. She was never just an observer. She was Margaret's older cousin, the forgotten one. Raised in the same house. Jealous. Bitter. She came to St. Millicent years ago, hoping to be welcomed back into the Endicott fold. But Rosalind had already taken Margaret under her wing. There was no place for her. Elizabeth's mouth parted. But I thought she was just kind. She watched, Miss Marple said. Always watched. She was there the night Rosalind argued with Hargreaves. She was at the cottage days before Rosalind died. She saw the letter Rosalind was writing to Elizabeth. She knew the will was being changed. She believed Rosalind had given Margaret everything, affection, home, even a child, and now she was giving the estate to you. Walsh shook his head. But why poison? Miss Marple looked down at the grave. Because Rosalind had one more letter, a letter that named Mrs. Alderton as the person who tried to blackmail Margaret the night she died. A letter Margaret wrote, but never sent. Rosalind found it, hidden in a box of baby clothes. She stepped back from the grave, and Rosalind was going to hand it over. She'd made her decision. It was time the past ended, but she never got the chance. The wind stirred the yew branches. In the distance, the bells began to toll. "Where is the letter now?" Elizabeth asked. Miss Marple reached into her bag and produced it, tied with a faded ribbon, the edges browned. She passed it to Walsh. "I found it behind the nursery wall, taped behind the old cradle. I imagine Rosalind meant for Elizabeth to find it one day, but the person who knew it existed didn't want to wait." The inspector opened it, read, then nodded. "That's motive enough." They turned, all three, toward the path that wound past the graves and toward the vicarage. As they did, another figure appeared at the edge of the path. Mrs. Alderton. She stood very still. She had not run. Her eyes, when they met Miss Marple's, were empty of fear, but also of remorse. "I gave up everything," she said. "My place in the family, my future, all for Margaret, and she never even saw me." Miss Marple spoke gently. "You weren't invisible. You were just walking the wrong path." A long silence passed. Then Mrs. Alderton stepped forward and placed her hands together. "I'll come quietly." And she did. That night, the rain lifted. The moon rose clear and pale over Fernley Hall. Elizabeth stood in the garden, the locket around her neck, the will in her hand. Miss Marple joined her. "It's yours now," she said, "not just the house." "The history," Elizabeth nodded. "What will I do with it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. Something new. Behind them, the old house breathed softly in the moonlight, and beneath the earth, at last, the dead could rest.